So it came to mind to talk about Socrates and Plato and the subtitle, if you received it in your email, as Relighting the Mystery Fires in the West, which is the other announcement I need to make. If you haven't put your name on an email list in the back, you can put your name and email address there, and you'll receive a reminder of the upcoming talk, and usually a link to an article on which the talk will be based. And if we have your email address, we can also, it gives us a way of telling you that a talk isn't going to happen if that should be the case. So you can put your name and email address in the back if you'd like. So what are called the mystery fires would have to do with what we talk about time after time here, which is could be called the perennial philosophy. So it could be just called wisdom or knowledge of reality. We know from subjects like mathematics and music and physics that if you study any of those things anywhere in the world, you're studying the same thing. They don't change. They apply everywhere. And that's kind of an analog to what are called the mysteries, which have to do with the nature of reality. And the reasons all the great scriptures are similar, if a person studies them kind of objectively, the reason all the great scriptures are similar is because there's only one reality, and they're all talking about it in different ways, but they're all talking about the same thing. So the mysteries that have to do with knowledge of reality and how it operates. And that knowledge would be the same anywhere where these ideas are taught, whether it's in the West or the East or India or Tibet or Crotona, Italy, or anywhere else. Basically, we're talking about wisdom and wise beings or sages or Buddhas, however you want to characterize it. And in the West, mysteries were first introduced by Pythagoras in Crotona, Italy. And Pythagoras had studied, and this is quite a thing if you think of it. He was born in Crotona, Italy, and he traveled for many years. And his travels included studying in India. And we're talking 700 BC. So at 700 BC, he goes from Crotona, Italy, to studying in India and studying in Tibet. And there are records in both India and Tibet of his having been there and studied there. So it's not hearsay. And Pythagoras started a school in Crotona, Italy, a mystery school, which had a physical location to which anybody could apply, so to speak, or ask to join. And of the number who asked to join, very few were admitted because they weren't ready in one way or another. And we're not going to stress here much on Pythagoras, but most everyone at least has heard of the Pythagorean theorem, but that's about all you hear about Pythagoras. You don't hear about the Pythagorean triangle, which is a triangle composed of points, 10 points. The bottom of the triangle is 4 points, And then the next level up is 3 points, and the next level up is 2 points, and at the top there's 1 point. The Pythagorean triangle, there are 10 points altogether. 4 on the bottom, then 3, then 2, then 1, adding to 10. The so-called perfect number. And that triangle appears in a slightly different form on the back of our dollar bill. It's the same idea, centuries later. And if one was admitted into the school of Pythagoras, the first things one was encouraged or had to learn were mathematics and music, both of which are doorways to what's beyond them, or that of which they're an expression. The school of Pythagoras didn't last very long. The people who had not been admitted, which was, as I say, most of the people who wanted to be, the people who had not been admitted grew in numbers, and they finally became angry enough that they hadn't been admitted. In some cases, their spouse had been admitted, but they hadn't been. So that, of course, created a great family harmony. And so after a number of years, these malcontents burned Pythagoras' school. As I say, it had a physical location. They burned his school with him and his students inside. And that was the end of the Pythagorean school, and the end of the first attempt to light the mystery fires in the West. Then after Pythagoras, you have a number of thinkers in the primarily Greece, called the pre-Socratics, and we're not going to talk about them either tonight. We have given a lecture on one of them, namely Heraclitus. All we have from these so-called pre-Socratic thinkers is fragments. They're amazing fragments, but nonetheless only fragments of whatever they wrote. And they're called pre-Socratics for an obvious reason. They came before Socrates. So we come to Socrates, about whom we've all heard. All we know really about Socrates, other than a few condescending remarks by Aeschylus, all we know about Socrates is we're told by Plato in his dialogues. And there are 3 dialogues of Plato's that have to do with Socrates, his teacher. And the most compelling one is called the Apology, which is an account of the trial and conviction and death of Socrates, Plato's teacher. Socrates really didn't have pupils, but he had people that spent a lot of time with him. And apparently what they did was they'd wander around, and as they were wandering around, they'd have dialogues with one another. Typically, Socrates would ask somebody what they thought something was, and they'd tell Socrates what they thought it was, and then he'd ask some questions about it, and they'd try to answer the questions, and it would eventually be shown to be the case that the person didn't know what they were talking about. Which some people liked because that meant they were learning something, but other people became rather irritated when Socrates dismantled their views of whatever it was they had a view of. And, so they'd wander about having these dialogues, walking around, and, quite happily. And we talked about a lady some time ago called Anandamaya Ma, who was an enlightened being. And she once said that ideally people would just eat their food in gratitude and then wander about. Well, what Socrates did was wander about, talking with people. And there are a lot of people in the time of Socrates, excuse me, as there are in our time, who claim to know things, claim to be wise, claim to be teachers, etc. They had reputations for themselves. They had followers. And Socrates, whose only claim to fame, according to himself, was that he knew he didn't know anything. And because he knew he didn't know anything, he was a seeker. Because if you don't know, you probably want to. So he wanted to know, because he knew he didn't know, which is a big step up. He said knowledge that one doesn't know is the beginning of wisdom. So Socrates was in a state of the beginning of wisdom, not knowing, kind of like children, not knowing, and they're full of questions. When 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, they drive us nuts with their questions because they want to know. And Socrates was like that. He wanted to know. And there were these people who were knowers, or passed themselves off as knowers. And so Socrates, being a man who wanted to know, and knowers being readily available, he'd go to the knowers. He'd go to the knowers and ask them what they knew. And they'd tell him what they knew. And to make a long story short, by engaging them in discussion and dialogue, it turned out that they didn't know anything at all. And this made them very angry. Because he would have these dialogues with these people in the presence of these people's pupils. So in the presence of their pupils, he'd dialogue with the person, and it would come to the point the person would have to admit he didn't know what he was talking about, or she. And this didn't make Socrates very popular with such people. And as he said, I've made many more enemies than friends, because he never found anyone who knew anything among those who claimed to know. You know, as I say, who had followers and so forth. So he was a kind of a pain in the side to such people. And they eventually got together, maybe not literally, but they got together and they'd had enough of this man. So they brought charges against him. At this point, he'd been doing this for decades. So he was relatively old, but he was still fully functional. But they brought charges against him, which were capital charges. That is to say, if found guilty, you'd be killed. And the charges were not believing in the gods, 1, and 2, corrupting the morals of the young. Corrupting the morals of the young translates as teaching the young to think, because that's what he did. And they didn't like the young people thinking. They wanted them, as we do today, just to be another brick in the wall, don't think, have our worldview, support our country, consume. Certainly don't start thinking. So corrupting the morals of the young and not believing in the gods were the charges brought against him. And if you're interested in Plato's account of that, it's in the Apology, one of Plato's dialogues, because we're not going to go into it. In the Apology is an account of Socrates' defense of himself against before these people, like judges or whatever, who are bringing these charges against him. So the Apology is what he said to them, at least Plato's account of what he said to them. And one of the things he said to them that's very important for our discussion is he said, the cause of most human suffering is people who think they know things but really don't. And he called that thinking I know when I don't, which is a form of self-deception. Thinking I know when I don't, he called double ignorance. Double ignorance. That's, to take that apart, that means if I'm in a state of double ignorance, there are two things going. One is I'm ignorant, and two is I think I know. And that state of mind, he says, is the cause of most human suffering. People who think they know and in reality don't. And he says this is the plight of mankind, double ignorance. It's the plight of mankind. And this is why he said the realization that one's ignorant is the beginning of wisdom. It's to get out of that double ignorance. And by ignorant, he didn't mean uneducated or unaware of philosophical or spiritual writings. You know, I can have a PhD and I can, in any subject, and I can have read voluminous things and have them all in my mind, and that doesn't constitute knowledge. So by ignorance, he didn't mean lack of mental content. He meant a lack of awareness of reality, which can't be found in schools or books. So being up against the death penalty, the people trying him pleaded with him, saying, if you'll just stop doing what you're doing, you can go free. And he said, I can't stop doing what I'm doing. This is what I'm here to do. If I were to stop doing what I'm doing, I wouldn't be doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So I'm not going to stop. So they gave him the option to save his life by just stopping. Don't say anything anymore. At least nothing other than news, weather, and sports. And he declined. And that resulted in his being declared guilty of not believing in the gods and corrupting the morals of the young. And when you're declared guilty of a capital crime in Athens, the way you were executed, so to speak, was that you drank the poison called hemlock. So the day came when Socrates drank the poison hemlock. Those who had been around him, his students and so forth, were there with him. And he treated the day like any other day. His state of mind was like it had always been, no different. He was just like casual about the whole thing. Drinks the hemlock. And he's carried on quite casually with these people that he's known for years and years. He's talking just normal, like nothing's out of the ordinary. And his feet start getting numb. And it's going to go up your body, and when it hits your heart, you die. So it's moving up his body, and he's just talking philosophy, and like he always did. He's talking as though it were just another day. But periodically he gives them an update on how far up his body the numbness is. Again, casually. Kind of like saying, the newspaper's here, the numbness has reached my knees. By the way, what do you think justice is? This kind of thing. And so when the numbness was pretty far along, one of his pupils, if you like, said, in effect, Socrates, I know this is, all this talk is well and good, it's just like it's always been, but you're going to die soon. Basically, this fellow was saying, let's get serious. You're going to die, soon, and don't you think you should, take account of it, And he finally said, what do you want us to do with you when you're dead? And Socrates said, you better hope I don't slip through your fingers. And died. And one of the things Socrates said, not there, but earlier, and he himself was a teacher of sorts, although he didn't have anything to teach. What he really taught was how to unlearn, how to get over thinking you know, which is the same thing Lao Tzu teaches in the Tao Te Ching when he says learning proceeds through daily addition, the Tao proceeds through daily subtraction. So Socrates helped people to subtract. He didn't have a teaching. He didn't know anything. He had nothing to teach. But what he could do is get us on the path where we become seekers ourselves if we can get to the point where we actually realize that we don't know. Like what death is, why we're here, how all this works, what happens after death, if anything. How am I supposed to treat people? We don't really know the answers to these things. We just have conventional answers, which Socrates could pick apart quite easily, not because he was malicious, but just because he's trying to help us get over our double ignorance. But one of the things Socrates apparently said somewhere during his life was that being a teacher, in the sense in which we just described, and he said the greatest thing a teacher can have, the greatest boon, is to have a student come along who can go further than the teacher. That's the greatest thing a teacher could hope for. Yes, sometime to get a student who can go further. And Socrates said, I've been fortunate to have such a student, and his name is Plato. So he got that boon of having such a student. Plato's writings, as some of you know, are in collected form, is in a book called The Dialogues of Plato. It's about 2 inches thick. Can't remember, a couple thousand pages maybe of small print. So there's a lot of Plato's writings survive. Plato too started a mystery school, as had Pythagoras before him. Plato was following in the footsteps of Pythagoras. The mystery school he started was exactly like the one Pythagoras had started. It had a location. It had strict requirements relative to entry, having nothing to do with education, IQ, sex, gender at all. So back in those days, if a person was a seeker and interested in and ready for them, whatever the mysteries are, it didn't matter if you're male or female. That problem started about 800 years later, when the women were relegated to a secondary position. But it wasn't that way in ancient Greece, and it wasn't that way in the days of Pythagoras. The school that Plato started, about 500 BC, lasted 900 years, unlike that of Pythagoras. Whatever he taught in the mystery school was transferred from him to the next person, from that person to the next person, down through 900 years intact. We don't know precisely what was taught in these mystery schools because they're mystery schools. And, whatever was taught wasn't written down. If a person reads the collected dialogues of Plato, it's voluminous. And within that collected dialogues of Plato, there's something called letters. Some letters he apparently wrote. And they're all numbered, 1 through something. In the 7th letter, he says, I've never written down any of my true teachings. And you're holding this book of 2,000 pages of small print, and suddenly you read, I've never written down any of my true teachings. So what are you supposed to think? And the reason he'd never written down any of his true teachings is because his true teachings were only given out in the mystery school. Entrance into which involved vows or pledges of secrecy. Not because of any dire intent, but because Jesus put it rather well. He said, "Cast not your pearls before swine, lest they turn and rend you." Hence the secrecy vow. I just got off on a little side trip about Einstein, I'm sorry. It was okay, yeah. Well, the side trip on Einstein was that he expressed great sadness at the fact that he'd made public his theories, which were subsequently used by others to build atomic weapons. And that would be an example of why such knowledge is kept secret, because it will be misused. So in Plato's Academy too, it's called Plato, the Academy, one studied harmonics, and one studied mathematics at the beginning, and one was also expected to lead a relatively pure life. So in one of his dialogues, namely the Republic, but also scattered through other dialogues, there's a question of what is justice? What is justice anyway? Still a question today. I mean, what is justice? In all of Plato's dialogues, as I said, there are three. There are three that have to do with Socrates, and all the rest are Plato's philosophy. And in all of Plato's dialogues, they're all dialogues between characters, and in all of them, Socrates is the main character, although it's Plato's philosophy. So the question comes up, what is justice? Which is a good question. And Socrates is asking the question, and there's this one fellow says, justice is being good to your friends and not so good to your enemies, which sounds kind of moronic. But if you think about it, that's how most of us function. You know, we're nice to our friends and not so nice to our non-friends, and we think that's cool. And Socrates says, well, that's a very interesting idea of justice. The only problem is, how do you tell your friends from your enemies? So that blasts that one out of the water. I mean, it gets elaborated, but the bottom line is you don't know. And if you're old enough and you look back on your life, you probably look back and someone you thought was your enemy turned out to be your friend, and vice versa. So that doesn't work for what is justice. So then this other guy chimes in, named Thrasymachus, which is actually spelled trashy Machus, which is how I remember it. Thrasymachus. So he has a view of what justice is, and his view of what justice is very simple. At least he states it very simply. He says justice is the interest of the stronger party. Justice is the interest of the stronger party. Whoever has the strength decides what justice is. And it's still the case today. Now somebody picked up on this centuries later named Machiavelli. It's the same idea. And if you look at the world, justice appears to be whatever is in the interest of the stronger party. And a corollary of that is almost cliche, that the winners write history. Well, the winners also decide what justice is. Now Socrates has trouble with this one because how do you get around it? I mean, it seems to be supported by the evidence. So all of a sudden Socrates starts talking about, supposedly addressing this question, justice is this claim, justice is the interest of the stronger party. Supposedly addressing this question, Socrates all of a sudden starts talking about the nature of human beings. What's a human being? So he starts talking about what a human being is. This guy's wondering, what's this got to do with what I think justice is? All of a sudden he's talking about what a human being is. Yes, he is. So he says, now a human being, this is Plato's teaching through the mouth of Socrates in the dialogue. Plato says a human being consists of three aspects. What he called the rational aspect, which we all know something about. We have the ability to think. That's the rational aspect. And then there's what he called the spirited aspect. And the spirited aspect would have to do, one, with emotions, and two, with the will. The will. And the third aspect he called the appetitive aspect. And the appetitive aspect would have to do with desires and aversions. So a human being has the rational aspect, the spirited aspect, the appetitive aspect. And those of you who have come into these lectures for a while would be aware that some schools of thought delineate 5 aspects, and people like H.P. Blavatsky delineate 7 aspects of human nature. Plato's only delineating three. You might say he's compressing the 7 into 3 because it wasn't yet time in the West to talk about the 7. So he's kind of giving kind of almost an allegorical account of human nature. And he says the problem is that these aspects within ourselves, or which make us what we are out of control. The rational aspect, which Plato says should be in control, isn't. What's in control is the appetitive aspect, desires, aversions, wants, grasping, the things Buddha talks about as constituting non-enlightenment. So most of us are being dragged through life, says Plato, by our appetites and desires and aversions. And we're putting our will in that direction, our spirited aspect. And we also experience emotions in relation to our desires and aversions, etc. Because when we're getting what we want, we feel pleasant, and when we're not getting what we want, we feel unpleasant. When we have something we don't want, we feel unpleasant. When we want something we don't have, we feel unpleasant. So basically, we go through life, with our appetitive aspect in charge. The spirited aspect is kind of going along and reacting to whatever's going on there. And the rational aspect has been usurped. It is used to rationalize the life based on the appetites and the spirited element. So the rational side of ourselves, in most cases, says Plato, is being used to justify a life based upon grasping at appetites and desires and aversions. So what should be ruling our lives, namely reason, has been co-opted just to rationalize inhuman behavior, inhuman in the sense that it's not being guided by reason. And this would tie back into also what Socrates called double ignorance. And Plato gives an image to characterize the situation of a chariot with being pulled by two horses. And the two horses are the appetitive element, and the chariot's out of control. It's just these horses are just taking off, and the chariot's out of control. There's no one sitting in the driver's seat, no one holding the reins. So the horses are just running wild, pulling the chariot behind them, and there's no one there running the thing, holding the reins, guiding it. And that's the state of most human beings, says Plato. The chariot, our life, is just being pulled along by our appetites and desires, and we're kind of along for the ride, but we're not in charge. And if we were in charge, we'd be assuming responsibility for what's going on in our lives, and which is rare. And it would have some control over the appetites and desires and the emotions, which is rare. So we're all kind of being pulled through life by our lower natures. And he characterizes this state, if you can think of it as a state, of these three elements kind of turned upside down from what they ideally would be. He characterizes this state as a state of disharmony within we're all in a state of disharmony because we're being pulled through life by these horses, and we're not in the driver's seat, which is why so many people, consciously or otherwise, perceive themselves as victims in the world, because they've failed to assume responsibility. They sit in the chariot driving seat. So therefore, everything that happens to me of a negative nature is the fault of something outside of me, which is patently false. But nonetheless, it's easier to think that way than to assume responsibility for what's happening to me. So this is a state of mankind. We're living in a state of disharmony, internal disharmony. In these days, they call it inner conflicts. Same deal. So if you're wondering what does he mean by disharmony, take a look at your mind and psyche. There's all kinds of conflicting stuff going on. Emotions, thoughts. It's not a pleasant, easy ride for most of us in our relationship with ourselves. So the state of disharmony, which Plato says is the state of most of us, in reality, this state of disharmony is mirrored in society. Kind of makes sense. If you get millions and millions of people not at harmony with themselves, then the society that results is going to be a society of disharmonious society, a conflicted society, which is precisely what we have today, or the world has today, with the exception of Dharamsala maybe, and wherever Amici is. This disharmony in the individual and in the state is the opposite, says Plato, of justice. So he's going to connect the idea of what is justice to the idea of harmony. he also taught that these three aspects of ourselves correspond to the three aspects of the universe as a whole, which we've seen in a number of previous talks, in the notion that as above, so below. This world is a reflection of something beyond it. We won't go into it, but Plato, if one asks, well, what does Plato say this world's a reflection of, or an expression of, he uses the word ideas with a capital I. Whatever they are. Carl Jung called them archetypes. This world's actually a mirror of what's beyond it, which is in turn a mirror of what's beyond that, until you get to the point in the Pythagorean triangle at the top of the triangle. And this leads to ideas as above, so below. So if we want to understand the above, it's kind of here, if we can see it. Plato said that the whole task of being a human is to become one man. It could also be a woman. You could say, but not person. Is to become one man instead of many. It's a one line. The entire task of being human is to become one man instead of many. No more conflict. Just one person there. So this leads into some philosophers call it the problem. I think it's just more a matter of perspective rather than a problem. But academics like to think of it as a problem, and I think for them it is a problem. Namely, the problem of the one and the many. If you assume there's a one, or an ultimate reality, or God, or the central spiritual sun, it's called different things in different traditions, but they all have something that's one, that's the source of everything. It's the apex of that Pythagorean triangle. And the big question, of course, which cosmology is trying to figure out today, is how do you get many out of one? Or put more colloquially, how do you get something out of nothing? How do you get something out of nothing? Why are there many, and where does manyness come from? Because we live in a world of, obviously, of manyness, many of everything. You can count them. It goes on forever. If you watch Sesame Street, that's what the count's all about. He's counting it all. There's a lot of it to count. So the problem in so-called the one and the many is, how do you reconcile them? So Plato talks about the one in the many. So even though there's all this manyness, somehow it's all one. And that's where you get the cliches, like the New Agers and the hippies, it's all one. Well, yeah, that's what they teach. But you can't see that it's all one because there's so many things in the way. Like if it's all one, how do you reconcile that with the fact of however many of us are in this room tonight? It doesn't seem like it's all one. I don't know. Does it seem that way to you? So to understand that the one in the many is not an intellectual exercise, it doesn't work. Or you could say it doesn't work existentially. We all go through the day, in oneness. We don't even go through a day within ourselves in oneness, and that's where the disharmony comes in. Because we go from one mood to another, memories, anticipations, happy, sad, up, down. That's manyness. So we got manyness inside, manyness outside. And Plato's saying, yeah, but there's the one's in the many. Or different tradition, Krishna's everywhere. Different tradition, God is a circle with circumference nowhere, center everywhere. That's the one in the many. So when he said the object of human life is to become one person instead of many, he's saying that the object of human life is to realize the oneness within oneself rather than the manyness within oneself. Because we have the manyness within ourselves. We've got all these thoughts, all these memories, all these anticipations, all these feelings, all these emotions, all these desires, aversions. That's many, many, many. But somehow there's a oneness that's possible to discover there. And that oneness would have to do with the rational element, what Plato calls the rational element. Not in the sense of thinking about things, but in the sense of seeing. And we've talked about this in previous talks, that the oneness within us would have to do with whatever it is in us that's aware of the rest of the stuff we think is in us. Something in us is aware of all of our stuff, aware of the world, aware of the past, future, whatever that is that's aware of all this. If one could metaphorically become one with whatever that is that's aware of all this, then one would have discovered the one in the many within oneself. In Buddhist language, one would have discovered the Buddha nature within oneself. One would have realized the Buddha nature within oneself, and consequently within everything. So if I think I know, I don't. Literally, if I think I know, I don't. It can't happen that way. If I realize the oneness, if I become one person instead of many, even maybe for like 5 minutes, then that realization translates into seeing that one in the many everywhere. So I can't see it within me without seeing it within everything. So there's no longer any separation. There's just the oneness within the many. But then you get the flip side of that, which is the many and the one, which can be analyzed also. Because the one's in the many, but the many are also within the one. And a good way of that helps me think about that, because I don't understand it, but it's a matter of progressive awakenings, to use H.P. Blavatsky's phrase. The many and the one, the way that helps me think about that is on a clear night you see all these stars, just endless stars. That's many, but they're all in space, which is one. The space is unaffected by whether there's anything in it or not. It's just one. The space your chair is in, and your body's in the chair, when you leave tonight, and the chairs are put away, the space that chair occupied with your body in it has been unchanged the whole time. There's something in it for a while, and now there's nothing in it. And the space isn't affected one way or the other. So space isn't affected by what's in it. So the many are in the one, but the one remains unaffected. Whether there's a universe in it or not, or whether there's a person in it or not, like we think of ourselves as people, whether there's a person in it or not, it's not affected by the true nature of one's reality is unaffected by whatever is appearing in it. what Buddhism calls the stream. We all have a stream going on, thoughts, feelings, all the things of which we're conscious. All those are occurring within something that remains unaffected by whatever's in it. And this is why a sage, be it male or female, is utterly unaffected by anything at all that happens. As the Bhagavad Gita says, a sage is not disturbed by anything that may come to pass. And that's not because they're indifferent, it's because they become one with the one or space. So whatever's in it doesn't affect them, because it's just something passing through, beginningless and endless. So becoming a sage doesn't mean all this goes away, it just means that all this is there's no longer a hook, one's no longer dependent upon having certain things present and certain things absent. Because as long as I'm dependent upon having certain things present, certain things absent, I'm a slave. Because I'm not in control of what's present or absent. And if my happiness depends upon what it is or isn't, I don't have any control over my destiny. Back to the victim idea. And when Plato says our life should be governed by the rational element, he doesn't mean just thinking about things. In previous talks, we've talked about the idea of manas, which translates mind, and they make a distinction between higher and lower. Higher manas is impersonal. That'd be the main thing. It's impersonal. Whereas lower manas, the lower mind, is personal. Everything's personal. It's about me as a person. So when Plato says the rational element should rule, he's talking about the higher aspect of the rational element, the impersonal aspect, the aspect that's not caught up in change and flux, the aspect that can entertain true ideas which are self-replicating and abstract in a good sense. Ideas like justice. Now Socrates taught, and Plato carried it on, that the way to move in the direction of trying to make the rational element dominant, using the analogy, trying to put somebody in the charioteer to hold the reins and guide where the chariot's going, to make that dominant, a process is required that they call dianoia, D-I-A-N-O-I-A, dianoia, which apparently literally translates as to think something through. This is what Socrates is trying to teach people to do, to think something through. A simple example would be, let's say I'm a recovering alcoholic. I've hit some kind of bottom. I was fortunate enough to realize that I had, and I wanted to get well, so I went to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I got well, the so-called obsession was removed. I no longer want to drink. So where was this going? Oh yeah, sorry, thank you. All's well that ends well. I can have a drink. So a simple example of dianoia, if I'm a recovering alcoholic and I suddenly have an urge to drink, what they might have taught me is think the drink through. So So I've got this strong urge to drink, but someone's told me learn to think it through, so I think it through. Where does it take me? Where has it always taken me? It's never going to be different. So you think it through and you realize, I know where this goes every time, I don't want to go there anymore. So you don't do it. That's dianoia. Applied in a very everyday sense. Think something through. Where is this choice going to, well, we don't know, but we can play the odds. Where is this choice going to take me? Where is this line of thought going to take me? It's going to take you where it takes you every time. You know, where does this emotion going to take me? Where is this resentment going to take me? Where is this attempt to be calm going to take me? Where is this attempt to think things through going to take me? So if we are interested in listening to the wise, of which Plato was one, Socrates said he knew nothing, Plato did know something. If we listen to the wise and take heed, then that's going to take us somewhere quite different from listening to ourselves or people who think they know. On a slightly more sophisticated level, dianoia would be, practicing dianoia would be to take, this is easier to do with other people, which is why they had dialogues, but at a slightly more sophisticated level would be to take my ideas of whatever I think I know, or what I've been taught and I've accepted, is to take what I think I know and think it through. All right, if I think death is such and such, or I think I know death and such and such, how do I know that? In the way Socrates and Plato taught pupils, which we don't have time to go into, but if I have a certain standpoint, a certain point of view, or a certain thing I think is true, the way Socrates and Plato taught me to do it would be, me being anybody, would be, okay, if this is true, something I think is true, what does that assume? If this is true, what else has to be true in order for that to be true? What are the underlying assumptions? And those are discoverable. And not in terms of likes and dislikes, but in terms of logic. You know, if this is true, then something has to exist to make that true, some assumption I'm making. And that assumption in turn, if taken to be true, must be true because of some assumption behind that. And that's dianoia, to keep going until you get to the point of knowing you don't know, because it's all rested upon assumptions that you're making, which you now become conscious of because you're thinking things through. So you get to that glorious point of knowing you don't know, which means you're back in the child state. And you're a true seeker, because you know you don't know. It's cool. As in the days of Socrates, so too today. We don't teach young people to think. We just feed them information and reward them for repeating it back to us. And the reward we give them for repeating it back to us is that we tell them they know something now. So rather than encouraging questions and dianoia to young questioning minds, rather than answering their questions with questions, we answer their questions with supposed answers. So we fill them up with answers so they no longer have any questions, because they now know, because they've been told the answers by their so-called teachers and the grown-ups. And then Socrates comes along and says, well, how do you know all this stuff you think you know? And starts upsetting the apple cart a little bit. And, Probably if someone is going around teaching young people to think, encouraging them to think, encouraging them to practice dianoia, wouldn't go over it that well today, for the most part. It takes courage to practice dianoia on oneself. You know, I mean, one could even ask, okay, who am I? We have some conception of who we are, each of us. Well, we could think that through. You know, how do I know who I am has anything to do with this body and walk around in? I mean, it's not a yes or no, it's something that can be thought through. How do I know who I am has anything to do with this job I have? Or this house? Or this incredible significant other on my arm? You know, how do I know who I am has anything to do with any of this at all? Was I ever born, or was just a body born? Will I die, or will just a body die? If a person asks such questions and gets a quick answer, then it's not dianoia. Because dianoia will lead to basically to the null point, or the 0 point. And we gave a lecture at some point called the zero principle. So the more one practices dianoia, the more one becomes aware of the fact that one doesn't really know much of anything. And consequently one becomes a seeker. See, it's not a bummer to not know anything. It's actually, as Socrates said, it's the beginning of wisdom, that realization. So if a person gets to that point, which is pretty rare, after the age of 7, if a person gets to that point, they might become interested in, well, what is going on? Is there anyone who actually knows what's going on? What life is, what death is, how all this works, what human interactions are actually about, how should we treat other people? You know, does anyone know the answer to these things? And not just different opinions. Does anyone actually know? Which comes down to the question, are there knowers? Do true knowers actually exist? And of course the answer is yes. At least they are said to. All the sages of mankind, the great teachers of mankind, probably knew something. And in the days of Plato, if I got to the point where I knew I didn't know and I really wanted to know, I might go to Plato's academy, as it was called, and ask to become a pupil under those who actually did know something, which is where the mysteries come in. Plato was said to be an initiate. Initiates, and the word initiate is capitalized. As far as we know, that has something to do with having been instructed at some level into the true nature of things. It's not something that can be obtained on one's own, hence the word initiate. The word initiate implies an initiator. So Plato was held to be an initiate by H.P. Blavatsky, as was Pythagoras. Socrates was not. It was said he was not because he couldn't maintain a focus of concentration long enough, which he knew about himself and accepted. It's difficult to maintain concentration for more than a few seconds. If you don't think it's difficult, try it. try to sit down and put your mind on something and just hold it there. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, 10 hours. To move into the mysteries, that ability has to be cultivated. And there is no fooling. I can either do it or I can't. Claiming to do it doesn't cut it. Claiming to be able to play the piano doesn't cut it. Let's hear you play. Most of you know who Amici is. If you don't, go to AMMA.org. You can find out who Amici is. And she has very few pupils. She goes around the world and hugs thousands and thousands of people and sometimes changes their lives just by giving them a hug. But she does have pupils, and she spends 6 months a year with them in her compound in India. And when she's going around the world hugging people, it's all this love and light and joy. But with her own pupils in India, it's all about strictness. It's all about rules. There's no fooling around. They meditate 8 hours a day, her pupils, with her sitting there. And I read one account of this person who was meditating. I mean, these are pretty advanced students. That if Amici takes someone on as a pupil, they're pretty far along just to be able to maintain concentration for 8 hours. And one person who was involved with this said on one occasion his mind started wandering and he felt this little bump against his head. And Amici had thrown a pebble at him and bounced it off his head because he'd lost his concentration. Now the point being that you can't fool a real teacher. If you're not unmarked, they know it. This is what Zen masters are all about. That's why it's so horrible, you know. And those zendos, where these guys are meditating, the master instantly knows when somebody's not, and they have to get a stick on the side of the head to get their attention back on, you know. So entry into Plato's academy involved studying harmonics, studying mathematics, and learning to focus one's attention in a sustained manner. One way to think of that is an image is you can get those little magnifying glasses, and if you take it out into the sun and hold it up to the sun and put a leaf down on the ground, you can focus a ray of light down on that leaf, and if you hold the magnifying glass steady long enough, it'll set that leaf on fire. But if you don't hold it steady, then nothing's going to happen with the leaf. So let's say the object is to set the leaf on fire. The only way it's going to happen is you can hold that thing steady. That's concentration. It's holding the lens steady so the light can come through it. If the lens is going all over the place, if the chariot's out of control, the light's to no avail. You can't start a fire. The mystery fire. Plato talks about, Plato distinguishes between what he calls the greater mysteries and the lesser mysteries. The lesser mysteries he had nothing to do with. He didn't teach, didn't care about them. They're diversions and side issues. The lesser mysteries include things like astrology, numerology, palmistry, tarot, all the stuff's going on. All that's the lesser mysteries, not a part of Plato's academy. Why? You can master any of those things, and you still don't have any knowledge, any true knowledge. So those are all traps for the seeker to be aware of and avoid, which would be taught in Plato's academy. To put it differently, the lesser mysteries have to do with different levels of the psychic planes. And they're psychic planes. They have nothing to do with knowledge, but they can be quite fascinating to people. So one of the problems in moving toward the greater mysteries is becoming fascinated by the lesser mysteries, which will stop you in your tracks. But it's people who have mastered some lesser mystery that were the kind of people Socrates went to ask questions to because they thought they knew something. Whereas in fact they were just worshipping lesser deities, which exist. So the greater mysteries, which is what we're taught in Plato's Academy, have to do with the knowledge of reality itself, movement toward the one. And as one moves in, say, Plato's Academy, this is pretty crude, but you could almost picture the Plato's Academy and that of Pythagoras. If you picture a bullseye like in archery, you get a bullseye and there's a center, and then they're basically 7 circles. That's how the mystery school would work. If you're admitted, you'd be in the outer circle of the bullseye. And if you mastered whatever you were taught there, mastered it, then you'd move into the next one. This is crude, but I mean, it's a good analogy. You'd move into the next one. So there'd be people in a lot of different stages in Plato's Academy. Some would be in the center, and some would be in the outer. But there'd be a feeling of equality among everybody, and everybody would kind of know where everybody else is. And those in the one circle in could help the one circle out. So because they've been there, here's how you overcome or master that. And so the inner circle of Plato's Academy had very few people in it. And one person who wasn't in it was named Aristotle, who never got into the inner circle, which meant he never got the highest teachings. And he was very angry that he didn't get into the inner circle, Aristotle. And because he didn't get into the inner circle, he never got the highest teachings. He didn't know what they were. But he was angry that he didn't get into the inner circle, so he started his own school. And he wrote his own books and books and books. And historically, Plato got forgotten, and Aristotle, we became an Aristotelian Western world. Even though Plato's Academy went for 900 years, Aristotle's ideas caught on, and Aristotle was not a knower, because he never got the highest teachings. This is a little sidelight on somebody gets torqued out because they think they should be, right in there in the inner circle, and they're not. They get angry and they write a bunch of stuff that changes Western history just because they got a resentment. Reality is stranger than fiction. Aristotle's teachings became the basis of Catholic theology, which dominated the West until the 19th century, not to mention most of the rest of the world. Plato, the Academy continued, but the influence in an obvious way didn't. So getting back to justice, what it comes down to for Plato, justice, is harmony. If I'm in harmony with myself, I'm just. If I'm in harmony with myself, I'll know what to do, how to treat people. If I'm in harmony with myself, that condition will affect positively my environment. Like just being in the same physical environment, to take an extreme example, as someone like Amici, just to be in that environment is to be affected for the good, because she represents a supreme form of harmony. Absolutely nothing's left out. So a person in harmony with themselves is just, but not in any definable sense. It just is. And it affects those around them, for good or for ill. Some people can rise to the occasion if they meet someone in harmony with themselves, and some people get threatened. So harmony in the justice in the state would be a state where reason is at the top. The appetitive element is being overburdened by the spirited element, which is being in control of the rational element. So in the ideal state, the people on top would be wise, and the people, like everyday folks like us, would be content because we're being led by beings who are wise, who have our own interest at heart. And this, of course, has never been the case in a real state. And it's the ideal state, says Plato, where we be ruled by wisdom and compassion rather than greed and avarice. So around 300 to 400 AD, thanks to Aristotle and some brilliant bishops, around 300, 400 AD, all the teachings of Plato, of Pythagoras and Plato, were declared to be anathema, which is it's a technical term in the Catholic tradition. If something is anathematized, it means it's a mortal sin to believe it. So Plato's teachings were anathematized. You can't think about human beings as basically good, but in a state of chaos or disharmony, but capable of moving in towards a state of harmony, which is their natural condition. That's an anathema now. What takes its place is original sin. We're all screwed at birth. It just gets worse from there. And if you want a way out, you have to come through us. So that's the exact inversion of Plato's teachings. Now you got me being born in a hideous state of unenlightenment or sin, and the only way I can get out of it is by doing what you tell me. Part of which involves me telling you everything about me. So now you know everything about me as a condition of me getting out of this state, which is pure bunk. That's like me saying, if you want to learn to play the piano, I'll practice for you. It's nonsense. Nobody can save us. Buddha can't save you. Jesus can't save you. We have to all do our own practicing on the piano. I mean, you could talk to the world's best pianist. That's not going to. You still have to do the practicing. We're the ones that have to learn how to focus. Decide that it's worth focusing. Decide that it's worth practicing a little dhyana on ourselves. So to end this talk, About 300 to 400 AD, all these ideas that we've been talking about were declared to be anathema. And the church came into its own. So from about 300 to 400 AD, these teachings, this knowledge, held by people like Pythagoras and Plato, remained intact, but it went underground, because if it were public, it would have been destroyed, literally. So it went underground about 300 to 400 AD. It was carried down through the centuries by secret, esoteric groups, which can be traced down through history. So the light was retained and transmitted down through the Dark Ages, but secretly. We've had talks on some of the groups that carried that light down, but it wasn't public and it wasn't available because it's too dangerous. It was subject to, things like the Inquisition. So that light started to resurface historically in a sense that it could be seen in the 14th century. And we've talked about that and won't go into it, but a Tibetan sage called Tsongkhapa decided in Tibet in the 14th century to send this light to the West at the last 25 years of every century, starting in the 14th, ending in the 20th. And the people that brought that light to the West, starting in the 14th century, can be traced. We've talked about a number of them. A big fire was lit in the 18th century by Saint-Germain, Mesmer, Cagliostro, involved in the same thing were people like Mozart. It became public again. It got persecuted. Some were killed, some were imprisoned. They're all defamed. They're all slandered. If you look up any of those names on the internet, it's mostly negative, calling them charlatans, etc. But they had the light. They were initiates. Never claimed to be. Initiates don't ever claim to be initiates. In the 19th century, the light got a lot brighter with the writings of H.P. Blavatsky, who made what had been hidden for centuries public through her writings and through her talkings and through her articles and through her esoteric teachings. The mysteries were once again public. And for the first time in centuries. And she too was slandered, libeled, ridiculed, mocked. She couldn't care less. Sages don't care what happens in the field. So she brought it all out more publicly than it had been in centuries. And what she brought out was a line that came all the way from Pythagoras, unbroken. And then R.N. Iyer, who Blavatsky had prepared the way for, she said, "I'm preparing the way for one much greater than myself." He's the one on whose articles most of these talks are based. And he referred to what he was doing as relighting the mystery fires in the West. In a very public way. I mean, all of his articles are online. They all have to do with the mysteries. If one really thinks about them, Some of you just read a sentence or two and think about it for a couple of days because it's there, but it's not like in your face any more than the music of the spheres is in our faces. So the good news is that the work of Pythagoras and Plato and Socrates was not in vain. And our children's 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 children are going to be aware of all these things much more than we are now. So it's been said. So the future is bright even though the present's dark. And if one can hang on to the idea that the light exists, and there are those who have it, then as things get darker, a person can stay in the light. Because the darkness is only kind of a ephemera. But it's going to look dark. So this idea of the misty fires, as things get worse and worse, and you get more and more nervous about it all, just think about the mystery fires. They don't change, they don't go out, they're available for the first time in centuries. Sages exist. What's to fear? So, thank you.